Hey everyone, did you know that Microsoft stole some code from me? But that's not really what happened. I sit down with Oleksandr Fediashov, a software engineer at Microsoft, to talk about their brand new Fluent UI v9 and the architectural similarities it has with the children-first design patterns that I've been talking about for the last few years.
So today we will talk mostly about Fluent UI React v9, but let me explain how we got to this point, because v9 sounds like a long path, and actually there is a small why behind it, because it's not v9 because there is nothing connected to v8. v9 was developed from scratch. It's an effort from whole Microsoft, because previously there were two flavors of Fluent UI, one that was used in Office, another was used in Microsoft Teams, and v9 is convergence. There are multiple challenges related to major breaking API changes and changing our vision. We went with v9, but as I said before, it's something completely different. It's completely new API library that features new design patterns, that features new way of theming, and completely new components that are focused on accessibility, focused on developer experience, and focused on performance.
So what is Fluent UI?
So there is Fluent as design library, there is Fluent UI Web as implementation of this design library, and there is Fluent UI React, which is a React implementation of this. And well, we will discuss in this video Fluent UI React v9, and more or less it's used to power all Microsoft 365 projects.
Yeah, that's used by a lot of users. Their Office now in the cloud.
Yes, it's used by Microsoft 365 projects, so it includes Word, Excel, it includes Microsoft Teams, and again, our goal to satisfy these developers, because there are a lot of them. They have a lot of requests. They have a lot of bugs reported to us, not because we are doing bad software, but because there are always problems that you need to fix, especially around accessibility and what I wanted to say around it.
Yeah, so you got a major dependency on lots of users. It's a Microsoft thing, so it's going to be hit by a very large audience, and it needs to have accessibility built in as well.
Yes, and we spent a lot of time around accessibility, and we invest a lot into accessibility to make our components accessible, to ensure that people with disabilities can use our UIs, because again, they will be used in large applications. And if the core, the foundation UI library is not accessible, it's not acceptable for big products. And we are continuously working in this area. We call this accessibility first model. So let me talk about patterns and about exact changes. So the most important thing that we changed is way how we use collection components, or well, calling it children first API is something different for me, because we traditionally just call it children API, and here, as you can see, is not supported. But what is key difference is that before we were relying on objects, arrays of objects to define children in case of accordion, in case of menu, in case of any collection component, menu, reaction group, and etc. It all was about objects. And well, we got a lot of feedback about how it doesn't scale, how it provokes really bad workarounds to pass custom components, how it's hard to customize things.
So what you're talking about is passing an array of objects into a component, and basically you have one component, in this case like an accordion, you're passing an array of objects into it. That's all the panels that are subpanels. And you're saying that people were coming up with problems because you were trying to scale it out, and it wasn't scalable because you had to add all these extra props so that they could modify it. But then at some point, it's going to be unfeasible to keep adding those kinds of props. For one example I can see from what I'm seeing here is that each one of these is some kind of accordion panel. But what if you wanted a heading in between them? You'd have to create like a separate component, but then somehow unite those states.
Yeah, the problem is that these components were not exposed at all. So we have accordion, and you actually cannot do anything to customize it. There is a way how you can do that. You can use a render function to do that. So you can just define children, and then you will get traditional render props. In this case, we replaced accordion title. Probably, I don't know even what kind of components is behind it, but we replaced it with plain div, so we can change it. We can also get original component. Okay,
that's the component that you guys are passing in. That's going to get rendered.
Components that should be by design. And we also can pass props that we predefined for it. So here we were able to replace or do some changes. We can pass additional props. We can use additional sponsor, for example, or even do some state-based changes. So if I will do something like that, okay, bad example, but anyway, I can apply props to the span, which works, but let's be honest, it doesn't scale well. And again, this is render props inside an object. And well, it also becomes very complicated to memorize it.
Yeah. It does. You're correct.
Yeah, because you would like to make this object stable, but it becomes pretty difficult. And well, the problems that we face that in this example, in this sandbox, it looks more or less simple, but in real application, I cannot show code, but I can talk about it, right? We have special hooks that define either set of these objects or a special hook for every object. And inside it uses memo, there are some special things, there are even some components wrapping. And let's be honest, it's unreadable, it's hard to scale, and it's bad design. And
yeah, you're basically outside of React at this point too. You're defining object syntax, but you're not defining what React would actually be rendering anymore.
Exactly. We're just defining objects because we are trying to combine data and we are trying to combine visual layer or rendering layer. And it's not natural and it doesn't work pretty well, to be honest.
Yeah, so this is what you had before in the past because that was the pattern that made sense at the time. But then you've got a new pattern now that you're looking at, and this is the children API that you're calling it?
Yeah, we call this children API, and it's what we have in V9. This component has a bit different design, but it's still accordion. And here we have accordion. We have accordion item, which is a wrapper around it. Then we have accordion header, and we have accordion panel where you can have your custom content.
Yeah, the first thing I'm seeing here is that there is each accordion item, anything that would have been in that object is now as a separate component. And even the title and the panel are also separate components. There's not an accordion item and there's a list of those and you just pass them an object. Each one of those then takes children. And so theoretically, you could even put the header below the panel if you wanted to, or you could put a different kind of header that has a different color or a different UI to it. Not that you would, but maybe in a different accordion set on a different page, you might want to upgrade that header to a new design pattern. And you could upgrade to a new design pattern by just swapping the component. Versus in the past, you would have to swap the entire accordion itself to just swap the styling of one of those. Or you'd have to, like you said, put the render props function in there to be able to get the same functionality.
Yes. And well, let's be honest, that pattern has reasons behind it because when it was invented, it was really a while time ago. And so there were no things like React context. Now we have React context. Now we have new beautiful APIs from React that we can utilize to implement this functionality. And yes, it looks closer to what you would expect from React. And it just feels naturally and it just follows React patterns. You have components, you render components. You don't have objects to define them.
Yeah, previously there was a meme posted about this by somebody that watches my videos, and it looked like, Microsoft or, you guys were taking the ideas that I had from earlier this year, but that's obviously not true because this took a lot longer than just 9 months to put together. And I'm curious how you guys even came up with this, because you came up with it independent of the work that I was doing.
Yeah, for me, it was also pretty interesting because, well, I checked your video and at some moment I was like, oh, it's real deja vu. Because it was the same way of thinking. How we came. So I came to Microsoft and before I worked on Semantic UI React. And if you will check it, it's actually the same API as we have seen before with
with the object
version. Oh.
Yeah.
So this API comes from there. And before, it was also possible to use menu and menu items like this. So you can either use objects or you can use JSX components, which is probably nicer. The problem is that in this case, you will have to control state manually.
Oh.
So if you have objects, we will control state for you in Semantic UI React. If you don't have objects, if you're using JSX component, you will have to control state. And again, it's a reason because when it was developed, there were no React context, there were no hooks, there were no fancy way how you can pass down state and how you can manage it. And when we came with this flavor of Fluent UI, which was called originally Stardust UI React, we decided that users probably don't like to manage state. They will love to use objects. And initially it was true. Then we got, let's say, not positive feedback about this API. And we started to look into new things and how to change or improve it. And as I said before, there was a thing made by Ryan Florence, if I'm not mistaken and pronouncing name correctly, which changed my way of thinking about it. Because if you look on this example with menu, it's actually pretty close to what we are discussing and it follows design. And I started to look into sources and I was like, I was thinking about it before, I was looking on it and now it like puzzle was connected. I shared it with teammates We were really excited about how we can change things, how we can improve things. And well, when we started to work on Fluent UI v9 around 2 years ago, 2 years ago? Yeah, 2 years
Oh,
ago.
wow. That's been a while.
Yeah, then we had option to follow this or to use this. And we decided that probably people will like this more. There is one argument which is kind of defensive to this and which protects this pattern. Again, we had a lot of discussion around it. In this case, you can control markup in a very strict way, right? Because you know where title will be rendered, you know where content will be rendered, and it's hard to mess them up. And when you have an application developed by thousands of developers or even more, it sounds pretty meaningful because you also would like to have these components accessible. It's another example that you would like to have some arrow navigation between them. And it seems that I already broke it with my changes.
So what you were saying before is that it seems like with an object, you can 100% make sure that the rendering is going to be done a certain way because that's exactly how it's expected to be done. And you can always make sure that the title's on top, the content's inside, something like that with an object because you're controlling the rendering. But because you gave people an out with the ability to modify children, you can also mess it up and break that pattern. So it doesn't have that strictness to it.
Yeah, because when we open this API where you can have workaround, when you can change what it will be rendered, we actually opened a Pandora box around it. And well, it's not an argument anymore to keep this API. And again, I thought about this flavor, but there is also, so that this is Fluent UI React North Star, or what we call version 0. There is another Fluent UI version 8, and okay, we enter React components, and there is also menu. So if we will check Fluent UI v8, it was in the same position. There were objects, this exactly same objects that were used to define menu items for contextual menu.
Yeah.
So even if we develop different libraries at the moment, because this and this are completely different libraries, we had similar API designs and we wanted to improve it because one of biggest motivations for v9 was to improve performance and improve developer experience to make apps more scalable. So developers will not find a way how to escape from our APIs. They will enjoy our APIs. They will like our APIs.
It's very controlling. You're basically defining. So this is like the problem of a library author is, do you want it to be exactly as the business expected it, or do you want it to be more flexible as any team might need it to be for their purpose or needs? And that's the difference, right? When you've got this array of objects, in this case, you're defining exactly how it's going to be done, and there's very little or no way to deviate from that. But in the case of the new API, you're giving the other teams more capabilities, more flexibility, more access to do it as they need for their particular use case. And it's not on you anymore, the library authors, to manage what's going on. It's on them to make sure they're doing it correctly and it's being done a certain way.
Yeah. And again, there is another problem or decision behind it, because with objects, you don't have much control over children that will be rendered, and you don't have much control around components behavior. So even if you would like to change something in accordion item, you will need to write ugly workarounds to do that.
It's not the intended behavior.
Yeah. Here, you can just wrap this accordion item with custom accordion item and enhance it as you want, or restrict API as you want for your specific use case in application. Or you can enhance this component and maybe style it differently for a specific case and make it reusable.
When you talked about Ryan Florence, that's actually also where I got my inspiration too. Now, I saw his video like a long time ago, this video from him in 2017, and it didn't really hit me until later how I could use those design patterns in the future. But I also implemented those. One thing that's really interesting to me is that you guys with the children API, is it all context, or do you actually have implicit props happening in there as well?
When I am saying implicit props, what do you mean?
I had this thing where I was doing my form library where the parent passes props into the child.
Okay, there is one place where we are doing it. It's related to triggers, but in other cases, it's more or less context only.
My thinking has changed somewhat on that. That's a little bit different. It's mainly because of TypeScript, but also because, yes, it doesn't make it clear what's being passed. And I don't like that implicit way. But because the API was so much cleaner and easier to use, it made sense for a form library in particular, which is where I first came up with the idea. And in the form library, you know exactly what's being passed. It's an on-change, an on-blur, and a value. And it's very simple to know that. And so for any form component, you know what's being passed. You don't have to worry about it. But once you start going into visibility and to picker and other things like that, then you start realizing that implicit passing of props can get more complicated and confusing for people. I don't think the pattern is necessarily bad, but that trade-off is a big deal because documentation is key, especially when people are coming into projects, they don't know what's happening in it. I've gotten frustrated in the past too for the same reasons of getting into a project and not really realizing, oh, okay, that's doing this. And I would actually be very frustrated when I come across that. So I figured in the future I'd find a solution. And it seems like I did find a solution. And the solution was to you do some kind of builder pattern to do all of the implicit props behind the scenes. And so you're in charge of how those translations work. And you can also see that they're happening themselves. And that allows you to basically wrap components with components. And the benefit of that is that you're separating logic from UI. And that's a big thing for me, is that your UI components just take props, and then your logic components pass props. And then you can define how that passing of props occurs. Instead of having to have a context in there, you would define it where you're basically passing the props in through the builder API. And then TypeScript can control making sure that, okay, you can't pass this, anything like that.
So it's hard to say what do I mean about builder pattern until you will show me code. But before we will continue, I would distinguish there are two cases because we started to talk about it. And I said that we are using mostly context. So in this case, when we have accordion, and we have accordion item, we are using context. And the reason for that is that we expect that users will be able to compose accordion item into something like custom accordion item, and they still want to have behavior which is built into accordion item working. So we will pass in this context something like active index, or houses. Okay, it's not visible in this code example. Active index proper, something similar, and it will continue to work for them. And they don't need to care about our contract between accordion and accordion item. Yes, we are hiding this contract from users, but still it's clear for them what is happening. There is nothing passed by accordion to accordion item. So this is first case.
Can we see what this looks like in action on those three accordions at the top there? Is it that only one opens at a time, or any of them can open at any point in time? Okay, so you have it set up where the reason there's an accordion provider component at the top is that it maintains the state of having only one accordion open at any given time.
Yeah, you can call this an accordion provider, but I think that it renders some DOM element. That's why it's accordion.
I see. Yeah. And so my example was doing that differently, and that's fine. Like, this doesn't have to be exactly the same. I'm trying to understand how this works versus what I've built on my own. And so you do render something, but it is a context provider as well. And then each item is a context consumer. And then inside of there, you have the header and panel. I'm assuming those are just being rendered. They're not specifically looking at context themselves.
Well, we need to check it because I'm not familiar with all components, but yeah.
If you need to close an accordion item from inside the panel, is there a possible way to do that?
So we have this API. So not we, actually React calls this API after controlled components or controlled components. So in this case, currently it's auto controlled. So you don't need to control anything. You don't have any on-change callbacks or something similar. Right? And you can also specify, like with plain input components, like with input element, you can also specify default value. In our case, you can specify default open items. If you would like to make it controlled, you can specify opened items.
I see. So if you want to put anything inside the panel to control it, you're going to have to maintain the state on that.
Yes.
Okay. How do you maintain the state? Is there a hook that you guys provide that comes with the same logic that you guys have in the accordion itself?
No, it's just on toggle callback that tells you what item was toggled, and there is open items that works. Let me check if there is example. There should be example for that. Probably this will be a good example. Let me open it in code sandbox. So we have open prop and we have on open change callback. On open change callback will let us know when we are changing state. So when menu closed because we are clicking outside, or when menu gets closed because we are clicking on a menu item. So for this case, we have this on open change. And another case is when you would like to control this thing, because let me just quickly replace it with a button, and let me just add on click on it. How we are calling the state? Okay, it's set open. So every time when I'm clicking on this button, I would like to open this menu. So now I have, it's a really strange example. Let me also add appearance primary, so at least we can distinguish them. So now we have a specific button that opens menu, and indeed we are changing state and menu component reacts on it.
So this is external state. Do you have a menu that has the state built into it?
Well, it's built into menu by default. So if I don't want to control it, it will work by default.
I see. And then you can pass props in it to optionally control it if you need to.
Yeah. And again, we follow this auto-controlled pattern from React. So if I would like to have this menu default opened on a page, it will be default open. And the same is for model. And if I will click outside, it will get closed.
I see. So you have some kind of listener also in menu that listens for the document to see if it's been clicked in.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So it's more than just a provider in this case. Yeah, it's got more things going on.
It's also the thing that controls state.
Okay, that makes sense. So menu has its own state, but then it can also accept states coming in. But when you accept states coming in, you turn off the internal state management.
We don't turn off it, but user's input takes precedence. So if I will just say that this menu is open, okay, Code Sandbox doesn't want to refresh. This menu will become unclosable because it's open true, right? And we don't have any state handlers.
Yeah. So it is basically turned off, the internal state, when you have something passed in from the outside.
Yeah, we can form it in this way.
Yeah, so something I'm noticing with the menu here is that we have like a menu element, and that's wrapping something called a menu trigger, and then there's a menu popover, and a menu list, and a menu item. So this is back to the component design. Instead of a menu just taking an array of objects, and you're passing all of those in, here you have all these children, and you're defining what the children are inside of there. And then some children might have some kind of contextual association with the menu itself. For instance, if you click a child inside of the menu, it would close the menu.
Yes, it's correct. So we have menu. As you said, it's state provider in this case. Menu trigger is connected to menu by context. The thing is with menu trigger is that menu trigger in this case renders nothing to DOM, and its go to apply props. So this button, we will talk about this later. And then we have menu popover, which is eventually this component that renders popover. Because what you can also do, and it's part of menu design, you can just take this menu list and render somewhere on a page.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be specifically associated with the menu. Do you have a default context for situations where you do that so that it doesn't error because it's missing the parent context?
Yes, we have default context values, so it doesn't throw, but in some cases it emits warnings. It's something critical.
Yeah, where it doesn't make any sense not to have a parent context. So one thing that's interesting about this is people probably don't realize is that you can take the menu item and swap it with something else, anything you want at this point.
Yeah, correct. And it's a use case that we're targeting, because what I would like to do in this case, I would like to take my menu group, let's say, create custom component for it. It will render it, and then I will just use it inside menu power. And here I can hide completely different logic. Whatever I want, I can consume some other context to define what items I would like to render, and it will still work.
What if you used a different component completely? So not a menu item, but a button in there. So you could make a completely different UI inside of the menu that opens.
So you just triggered my manager, who is passionate about accessibility, because his advice is don't render buttons in menu. But yeah, you can pass button here and it will still work.
So you could have like a search bar there too. There could be more that you put in here that is almost like a select at that point.
Yes, you can do that. The problem that at this point it probably becomes inaccessible. Because I don't have a screen reader close to me, but okay, it's even broken in this case sometimes. Okay, it was because I was studying. It's still navigable, but it's not the best accessibility pattern that you would like to do. Inside menu, you would like to have menu items.
Yeah. The point from my perspective is that you're designing something that allows that customization, so that if you have a certain UI that is accessible, that you could put in whatever you need, or you can change the way things are set up based on the needs of the project. And I know the accessibility can get kind of wild because that button has a button role, and it doesn't have a menu item role, which would be something, or the menu itself opens a combo box or a list box, right? And it's expecting a certain set of items in it and not a button. And I understand that. But the fact that this is more modular like this allows you to have that control where you could, for instance, make your own menu item component and put it in there that would have the proper role and accessibility in there.
Yes, but again, it becomes a problem in some cases. For example, okay, you can replace their menu item because menu item doesn't have state. You can also replace menu list because it doesn't have state. If you would like to replace menu popover, then if you will simply wrap it, it will work. But if you would like to replace it with completely different component, then you will also need to manage state somehow.
Yeah, so something I'm thinking of where you might replace a popover, because right now what happens is you click any of the items in there and it closes the popover. So the popover must have some listener of a click inside of it or any of the children, and it closes when that occurs. And if you click the button, I'm not sure how that would work, because buttons tend to like eat click commands. So if like a click occurred, the button would eat it and then it wouldn't close. But I'm wondering if you wanted to have something where you had checkboxes in there. You don't want it to close when you're checking a box. And so if you had a checkbox list inside of your menu, which I know these are all kind of wild assumptions here, but then you might want a different kind of popover that you would use, and you would want a popover that maybe you'd create yourself if it didn't exist, where it doesn't close when you check a box.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me talk about this use case because it's what we covered already. Because this was our business requirement.
You have it.
We have checkbox inside menus. We also have radius, and you can notice behavior difference when you're picking a radio. It gets closed if you are using checkbox.
So do you have a different popover that handles that, or a prop on the popover that you take?
We have different component called menu item checkbox and menu item radio.
How does the popover know to close or not close?
Well, I can be wrong, but it's based on DOM event propagation. So we just stop propagation. And here we are. So here we have...
How's this onClick getting into it?
Okay, so we have a state object that basically defines what will be passed to DOM elements. And here we have onClick. We are composing this onClick in a way that we will call onClick, which is coming from props. It's our rule number one, actually. If we have handlers that are coming from user, and these handlers are DOM-like, for example, onClick, onKeyDown, we always call them to ensure that users will not be frustrated if they don't have this desired behavior that they would expect. So we try to behave like DOM primitive elements. So we enhance this onClick, and we have this toggle checkbox. So this toggle checkbox probably does something fancy. We'll figure out what it does, but here we can notice that it comes from context. And it's a separate story about what we will need to talk, because this uses context selector. But now let me try to find where this toggle checkbox. And you asked me about default values. By default, we have callback that does nothing. So
so for the context default value. Yeah. So if you use this outside of a context, it still renders. It doesn't error. That's something that I think a lot of people need to do in their component libraries, is make sure that when you have a context defined, you put a default value in there so you can test it separately. From my perspective, I usually use Storybook, and when I'm using Storybook to render these components out, I need it to have default values. I don't want to have to render in the context anytime I'm just rendering a single component, and that allows it to have greater separation as well. Even if your component expects the context to be there, if you have a default value in your context, you can at least have a void function available so that maybe the onClick doesn't do anything, but at least it renders correctly and you can use it for unit testing and other things.
Exactly. Because the things that you dislike the most when a component throws without context is that you cannot use it separately, and you cannot use it even in unit tests.
Yeah, because then you have to mock the context, and how many contexts are you mocking? Sometimes you could have a context that depends on a context, that depends on something else, and depends on, and then now you have 4 or 5 components in a unit test. So that doesn't make sense. It's not a unit anymore. It's an integration test.
Exactly. And it seems that I don't have answer for you how it works.
What's the radio button doing differently? The radio menu item? Because it's got to be doing something different.
I believe that there is one level up sync.
I'm wondering if it's in the component itself. So where it calls the onClick that's there. Maybe there's an extra one that's referencing the context and closing it.
There should be something other, which is listed in parent menu context. So let me try to find it. Okay, not this. Set checked values, use event callback. So when it defines when to close. That's pretty interesting. Okay, maybe under use menu.
Yeah, so something important here too is you're not the only developer on this project. Yeah.
To be transparent and clear about it, I reviewed a component implementation, but I didn't implement the components. So for me, sometimes it's hard to say. So one of bits that was interesting for you, yes, we're handling use click outside with this thing. And now the question is, we also handling close on scroll, on mouse menu enter, should handle tab ref. Okay, it's probably, we can say that I cannot answer this question. You can probably just start debugger and debug it. So, okay.
Yeah, I'm really curious. I want to know. I don't want to just leave it there.
Okay, so let's start again. So yeah, it's not getting closed for sure. So there should be something that controls state, and as we figure out, it should be on top level also. Then we have which hack to handle will happen there, but okay.
What was that menu item checkbox we were looking at, or was it use menu item checkbox where we had that object?
It was use menu item checkbox.
Do you have a different use menu item in there that we could use that closes it?
Yes, we have base use menu item, which we composed. Right?
If this has like an on-click in it that we can find that when you click it, it does the close in it. This one just does props.onClick, so there's no checkbox here. It said open, false. So this is where it's closing it.
Okay,
yeah,
probably. On click. So the question is, what are we enhancing there or we are replacing?
Yeah.
The answer is that we are probably replacing, but I would like to be sure. Okay, let me start it.
So it looks like from what I'm seeing, toggle checkbox is a different function from the base use menu item. And then in the base, it's actually closing it by setting the state. And so it must have access to context. So what we originally thought didn't have access to context, the menu item, it actually does have access to context. And that's how it knows how to close. And the checkbox doesn't call that function.
So what we have here, if I will compare side by side, checkbox and radio, they do more or less the same thing. So they just call different function. Okay, WebStorm.
What is that different function doing something like this is a use menu list context versus
there is select radio and there is toggle checkbox. So now we can jump to use menu list and try to find out what is different. So here we have logic to understand what will be new array of items, and then nothing happens there. This is the problem that I'm facing because there is nothing that says close or keep it opened, because we have just new checked items here, and that's actually it. Okay, maybe problem or solution is not there, but I think that actually it's what I missed, persist on click.
Yeah, which was in that the base one.
Yeah, if we check, it's not there, but if I will check, it's here. So yeah,
so there's a persist on click prop that's passed in, but then where's that referenced? It's referenced in the base somehow that eventually this gets called use event callback, and it checks.
Yeah, you see that, we are enhancing on click. And so our question was, is it enhanced or is it replaced? It's enhanced, and we are passing persist on click, and this is not code, so we are not closing it. This is the answer.
Okay, that makes sense now. So that's how it's knowing to close or not. That the base use menu item, which does refer to context, because otherwise it can't set the open state of the parent.
Yeah.
Is this a separate context though? So there's one context we know that is the menu itself, and then there's the menu item, and then this is a child in the menu item. Does menu item also have a context?
So there is menu that has context, there is menu list that has context, and there is menu item which consumes both of them.
Does it then provide its own context as well, or it just references those?
No,
okay,
just references.
Okay, so menu list is the one that we're closing.
Actually, menu.
Menu. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, it would be menu. Okay, I see how it is.
And there is a reason why it's split, because in Fluent we have this business requirement, and I believe that there are not many libraries that are doing it in a sensible way, but let me try to find. So interaction, checkbox, radio items, control, selection group, nested submenus. And now I'm navigating with keyboard, I'm pressing enter. Now I'm inside menu, I'm on focused item. Now if I will press enter, I'm in child submenu. One more enter, I'm in another menu. And if I will press left, it gets closed. Press right, it gets opened.
And those are all subcomponents and components of it. Yeah, I'm curious how you've set that up to make that accessible. I mean, there are native ways to do it, but it is interesting. And then when you click any of them, it does close the whole menu, which makes sense. Yeah, you wouldn't close the list. You would close the whole menu. But you do close the list as well, but only when you're pressing left and right.
Yes.
Where's the code for that when you're pressing left and right to close the menu list versus the menu?
Okay, let's try to find out. So there should be use menu list itself, I believe. Oh, there is another feature that I would like to show it, right? Because I'm trying to solve Fluent now. So if I will press O, you see that in this menu, we have open file, which is disabled, and then we have open folder.
So it should go to open folder, right?
I think that I broke something in my DevTools. Yeah. Yeah, it interacts with my DevTools. Let me just open another browser. I was debugging something today and it went really wild after that. But I believe that in Edge, I also broke it because now it reacts on something that it shouldn't, because it should work. But where is our example with nested submenus? Okay, here we are. Yeah, it shows grid layout for some reason. I don't know why.
But it should select the open folder, or if you hit P, it would go to preferences. And if you hit P again, it would go to the next one, or would it go to anything with PP?
It's a good question because I don't know, but if I will press A now, it goes to A.
Yeah.
If I will press E, it goes to E. And I don't think that in this menu we have something repeatable. Okay, we have in this menu.
Yeah.
So let me try to go with S. And it's another hotkey on my Mac that I don't know. Oh, it's not hotkey of Mac.
Yeah.
It's a storybook hotkey.
What if you hit EE here in the middle section?
Okay.
Or ZZ,
yeah. So it goes to next.
It goes
but
to the next one each time. Okay. Different from how Windows Explorer works, but it's maybe more what would be expected on the web.
Yeah, it's probably more something that is more expected on web, I would say. So yeah, we have these functions that handle this. Code set focus by character. So this thing manage focus, and I believe
there's a lot of state you got to manage to know which one's currently selected. Yeah, a lot of state. So when you're talking about accessibility, I mean, there's a lot of effort that has gone into the accessibility. It's not just setting some roles and making sure those are correct. You're also making sure all the keyboard navigation and everything else, maybe even audio cues, everything is working as expected. There's probably more behind the scenes here that I'm not even seeing.
Yes, and especially it's related to focus management, because we have separate library to do this, but there are a few common patterns that you have something called focus trap, for example, with dialog, because you would like to keep focus inside dialog when you're doing arrow navigation. You don't want to allow user to jump to somewhere random into random place.
So what you're saying is when you have like a modal or a dialog pop up, you want any tabbing and anything to remain in that box until they've closed it.
Yeah.
And you don't want it to seep out into the document behind the scenes, which is still open and still there in the HTML, but you don't want that to happen. You want it to stick to that dialogue.
Yeah. And again, it's a strange problem with Storybook because Storybook has different iframes.
Yeah.
But
I see it coming out of there because the iframes.
Because this grayed out area is an iframe, but I cannot leave this area. I cannot jump to anything in this area. I mean,
yeah.
One.
You're not jumping to the story itself. You're jumping outside into the rest of the storybook navigation, but you're not jumping outside to the document behind the scenes when you're in the iframe. That makes sense.
And
if you can,
pattern,
I mean, you could open it up as a separate thing too. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know how to do this in our Storybook.
Yeah, yours is missing some controls I'm used to seeing.
Yeah, because we intentionally disabled them for dockside, but I probably can show it locally. The problem is that I will need to start another Storybook. We will get back into in a second there.
Is this a custom loader for Storybook? Because it looks like you're building a specific component.
I'm building a specific package. So each control has own package. So then we can build them separately and run them separately. And now Storybook, come back to me. Here we are. So now let me zoom it in. And here we have control to jump out. Here we are.
Yeah, standard.
So now we don't have any iframes. We are in separate windows. So I'm pressing enter. I'm opening dialog. I'm navigating with tab. I can jump to URL panel, but I cannot leave. It's actually strange that this effect.
I saw it highlighted the open dialog and then went to close really quick. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not repeating anymore. So here we're now in circle. We can navigate inside dialog, but we can jump to URL bar. And it's a difference compared to different libraries because some libraries lock you on a page. And if you would like really leave this page, you don't have any way. Because you cannot navigate into URL bar, but...
Oh, so your trap allows you to get to the URL bar, but you're still stuck to the dialog. And you're saying other libraries, they just stick you to the dialog. You can't get back to the URL bar anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So now, as we started to talk about accessibility, let's talk about another pattern which is visible in menu. It's a navigation group. So if I will navigate between this, I'm pressing down and I'm navigating inside this group. So up, down, we are navigating inside this group. There are also different kinds of this group because this group is just vertical navigation. But let me check if there is implementation of horizontal. Probably
I was thinking table. I don't see table.
Oh, table will be interesting for you, but we probably want to look into data grid, which is more complex. So you can navigate. Okay, it's not latest deployment, I see, because this problem was fixed. So you can navigate between, will be cells. You can navigate between them, and you can navigate vertically and horizontally. So it's another accessibility requirement that we have.
That's nice. Yeah, I mean, this is something I would expect from Microsoft. I've been using Windows for so long, and I do use these things. Yeah, when you say accessibility, from my perspective, what it means is that you can do things in 100 different ways based on your control or input device. It doesn't necessarily mean you need some kind of disability to use those features. If you do the roles right, typically the browser handles a lot of things for you, but there are weird cases where you need to start handling things yourself, especially if you're using divs and you're not using the HTML structures. Like instead of using a table, if you're using a bunch of divs, well, then now you need to handle how the browser manages those controls and how you can do it and how a screen reader assumes what things are, and certain things you don't want a screen reader to see, you got to mark it as like presentation or something like that, where it just doesn't exist for a screen reader. And there are different things you got to do. And the hardest part, I think, about all these is I don't use all of these tools all the time, every day. And so it's difficult to test for it. I think most companies don't have people on staff that use these tools every day. And so it becomes difficult to test for them.
Yes, and what is more difficult and problematic that you need to across platforms, because on Windows you have one screen reader, on Mac you have another screen reader.
Oh.
So on Windows it's NVDA, on Mac I believe that it's VoiceOver. I'm not working with this area, so I can't say much about it, but yeah, we have accessibility experts that handle a lot of things for us and talking to us what we need to implement. But as you mentioned, Windows, keyboard navigation that we implemented for menu is actually inspired by Windows a lot, because we're trying to align web and desktop. And that's why there are a lot of behaviors, and we are trying to implement all of them if we are not limited with platform. And keyboard features are part of accessibility concerns, but it's also a requirement, as you mentioned, for power users. So if you would like to get more from your machine, from your application, you will use your keyboard, and you should be able to do that.
That's interesting. I want to look at some more API and see what changes you guys have made. So we looked at accordion, we looked at menu. Another big one is like a modal or a dialogue.
Yeah, dialogue, it's where we will discuss it. One more pattern that we changed. So let's probably start with dialogue in previous iteration. And if I will show some code snippet, you will see something familiar. We have...
Oh, the trigger takes a button. So it's a prop here. So you have a dialogue and then there's a trigger prop and that takes a button. So it has some kind of children ideas to it, but you're not passing the button as children into a trigger component. You're passing the component into another component, but not as children.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's where we have been. It's where we landed on.
Yeah. So now there's a dedicated component for the trigger that hooks into context, and then you can put whatever button you wanted inside of there. So trigger is the logic container. And this is the thing where you're saying it's implicitly passing in the onClick. Yeah. So the trigger is passing an onClick into the button by cloning the child and putting it in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the pattern that I'm trying to get away from going forward. The button takes an onClick. That won't change. But instead of doing that implicit pattern, I would have a function that you call at the top of your file, and it creates the trigger for you. You tell it how to pass that into your button that you're passing in there. It's maybe a little bit more complicated. And so you would build it once, and you would use that function to basically wrap this, and you could create your trigger that way. It's a little bit different from what this is, but this is how I did it in the presentation. And this is how I have done it in the past for the last few years. Was this, where you have the trigger and it implicitly passes the onClick into the button.
Yeah, and it's an area where we are trying to improve. The problem is that, let's be honest, we will not be able to change this design soonish, ever.
Yeah.
But we are looking how to make it more error prone and ensure that, okay, some artifacts from export. Because I will just show you a problem that probably you and everyone seen before with this pattern, that you have my button, which is not spreading props. And I will just take this component, I will pass it here, and then I cannot open this dialog anymore.
There's no context reference. There's no other way. Yeah. So there are a few options to fix this. One is to add a context to my button, but now the users have to be aware of your context existing, and they don't know. There's no clear explanation here that trigger has some kind of context it's providing so that you can click on it and whatever. So I don't personally like that, because that's even worse, in my opinion. The other way is, like you're saying, you spread the props, which again, now you have to know to spread the props, and that's not as bad because you don't have to worry about this extra context. You just kind of say, there were these props being passed in, I just need to pass them through, but then you get pass-through props. And then the other option, which is what I'm doing more recently, is you're going to create my button by running it through a function that builds out your dialogue, and it would return you all these components. So instead of importing all of them, you would import like a creator function, and then it would return you all these components, and then you can put in there your button, and then it would, basically something like this. Maybe it'd be create the trigger, maybe it'd be create the dialogue. Either way, it'd be something like this. And then you would pass in, it wouldn't give you a component necessarily. It would give you the values that would be in the context, I think. I can't remember. Yeah, it's something like this where you basically wrap it and it returns you the trigger or the button that includes the context or something like that. And then you don't have to, as a user, know that the context exists. You just have to run this pattern that allows you to create it, and it wraps it and it gives you the things that you need.
So you basically have something like that. So if you go, I'm not sure that I'm writing.
I'm not sure either, so it's fine. I wish I had remembered
So
this.
is there something like that when you are mapping some props to component? Like
Yeah, and
render
you
props?
choose, like the translate props function, and you would choose what the props are.
Or you are using something like...
It would be the props that come in, and you would return back the props, and it would get rendered into your button. Something like this, yeah.
Yeah, and I believe that I see benefit that you have there, because so you can inference this type from my button and understand what props it has, and then if they're not assignable there, then it's screams.
Yeah, so this is mainly for the benefit of TypeScript. Otherwise, I would have just had it implicit and been done with it. But this does solve that, and TypeScript will warn you, and not the actual API. And so this is the solution that I've landed on. Is something like this. I haven't developed it yet, but this is the solution I'm going with in the future to solve this implicit props problem, where, like you were saying, you can't now wrap it, and it becomes a little bit more difficult. But I also don't want users to have to know about my context. They don't have any reason to add a use something into their button that they've created, because the button shouldn't know about a context related to dialogue. Buttons should be more generic, just take props, and they shouldn't have anything to do with it. So this allows them to basically create a button, unit test the button, make sure it works with props, and then they can essentially wrap or add in the context dynamically when they need it in a case like this. And they could even put this in a separate file for the dialogue.
Yeah. And partial solution to this problem, it's to use render props, because it's what is already supported.
Mm-hmm.
So there are props that you need to apply, and then you can use my button and apply things to it. I just wanted to comment on it because in our conversation before this, you mentioned that you're not a big fan of render props.
Yeah, really.
But there is one benefit in this, because now contract is type safe, because here we should have types, and it will be direct trigger child props.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not assignable to this component, at least compiler will throw.
So this pattern is also possible. The main reason I don't like render props is because you lose the memoization. You're essentially creating a component in place inside children, but then it's not memoized. And that's the big problem I've run into.
Okay, so maybe I dumb and I don't understand something. Let me know. But you can do just this.
Oh, I never thought of putting it in use callback. That might work.
So then it's memoized, and if I will use it like that, it should still be rendered.
Yeah, that would work. I think the problem I have with that is indirection, but it does work, yes. It's just as much indirection as creating the button and wrapping it, passing the props. It's actually probably less indirection, I would say, than that. It's kind of janky because you're creating a component with use callback. When I have ESLint rules, I think they would complain in that case, because R is a component now, and you're passing it.
It's a trick. R is not a component here. It's just a function. Function can be component, but...
So it depends on how Babel or ESLint or something is interpreting that function, because it's a function that returns a component. And typically functions that return components are components. But in this case, it's not a component. It's a function that's returning a component as a wrapper. But I do like this use callback. So that is a solution. That's something I haven't considered at all.
And still, I think that there is a lot of interaction even with this.
Mm-hmm.
And when we have this fancy button, which we have here, and we have some content around it, then it's nice. It's awesome. But the problem is that for what I'm looking for, it's implementing more validation and trying to ensure that props were actually applied to a component. So maybe in development, I'm just sharing ideas that I had before about it, to have some data attribute which gets passed down, so we can ensure that props are passed down. And if this data attribute appears on DOM element, then it means that everything works end to end. And if this data attribute is missing, then we can emit a warning that please check, maybe something is going wrong. At least it will protect us from a case we are not spreading props.
But how would you know it's missing? You'd have to look into the children and see if those children have that prop.
Well, I intentionally said if we will decide to do that, I will be doing this on DOM level, because we just need to understand our position in DOM and just emit something like use effect and just traverse DOM down, or actually use document query selector, not document, but on this element use query selector to ensure if it's there or not there.
So you can check the rendered child or something to see if it has it. Man, that would be tough, because I don't know how you would know which child it is or where it is to know that.
Well, it's one of ideas. I'm not saying that it's ideal, because technically when you have triggers there, you don't care much to which component it will be passed. You want to ensure that your props that you passed and your handlers are in place. So maybe DOM is not the worst idea, but again, it's not implemented yet, so it's hard to say. Maybe when I will implement it, I will cry about it and will forget this idea forever.
But this is the thing. So I know the React community doesn't like this, or at least Dan Abramoff posted something that was like, are you guys using this pattern anywhere? And I gave him my talk, the presentation, which was accumulation of like years of me setting this up and saying, okay, finally here I'm going to present it. And then I found out that people are like, oh, this is an old pattern. Well, first, I've never seen that before, the clone element pattern in the past. The only place I've seen it was Ryan Florence did something with it, and in maybe React Router, but I've never seen it anywhere else. So to me, saying it's an old pattern is kind of weird. Somebody related to mixins. I never used mixins. Like I came into React in 15, so I completely passed that. So I don't know anything about it. And then there's the like you guys were using it too, and I was saying, okay, maybe there's something more to it, but I do know this pattern doesn't really work well in solid.js. They actually return a DOM element, so then you can check the DOM element at that point. It's not a pattern that would work well there because it renders a different direction from React. So the parents don't have access to the props of the child, and the only way to do that is to render something out, and you lose some performance enhancement that way. So because of all these things, I tried to solve it for years, and I said, okay, well, it's not solvable. So I'm going to look for a different pattern that I can use to do the same kind of thing, where you get this implicit props pattern, but then it doesn't have to be implicit anymore. It can be explicit. It can be type safe. Okay, the logic is in this container, and the styles are in a different place. And that's one of the things I really wanted to separate, is the logic from the styles. And that's what you guys did here, but it ended up being that you solved it in the same way I did, which also has the same issues of my solution.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but it's true. So again, there is this API called clone element, and I mean, it's used probably in any UI library. At least it's used in Fluent, in any flavor. So it was used in North Star, it was used in V8.
Oh, wow.
It was used also in Semantic UI React, about what I talked, because triggers have been also there. The problem with this API is that, again, it has implicit behavior. It's nice, it's great, but it has implicit behavior. And the learning that I have from communication with application developers is that you never know what developers will pass you to children. And this pattern kind of forces you to know, or creates some implicit contracts that we don't know what will be passed, but we will pass some props.
Yeah.
And again, it looks nice, but it's what I don't like, and it's what I would like to improve. Don't know how, because there are no other APIs in React, but let's see.
Yeah, this to me is not solved by a context. Everybody keeps saying you're going to solve this by context, and I think they don't understand the problem, because if you're solving this with context, you're doing it wrong. The button does not need to know about a dialogue. The button does not need to know about a modal or an accordion or anything like that. It should just be a button that takes props. And so you would have to create some kind of wrapper around it to give it that context. And I don't want users to have to know about context, because context is also implicit and it's also internal and it has nothing to do with them. And so the right solution for this is something like you've shown here, or, you know, I've shown with the builder pattern, or something where you're giving users access to what you have, but not telling them you have to know I have this thing and you have to use this thing that you don't know exists so that you can hook your button and wire it up, you know, this other piece. That's the thing both of us are trying to avoid, is making sure that the users can get access to modify the functionality or put their own button in there or do something like that with that flexibility, but not have them have to know anything about the implementation details of the components that we've used to wrap it, the logic that goes on behind the scenes. Yeah, that's a big, hard problem to solve. What's interesting, if you go to docs.oneform.dev, and like this is a very simple example of where I made it, and field is passing into input the on change in the value and the on blur. And what's important here is that it's all built in. It's very simple, very easy, and you can build out forms like this. And the reason it works with forms is because forms only have a set of props that they're passing in. And so it's very easy to know what's being passed in. And when I started scaling this out and doing it with other things, it still made sense in those cases, but it was the moment where I started trying to make it more generic and use it in a whole component library that I ran into the same issues that you're seeing just for that one button, where it doesn't scale as well. Actually, the issue I came up with was it has an inheritance problem. Once I got to that point, I realized I need to be building this completely differently, but still with the same idea of separation of concerns and making sure that you don't have all this tight coupling. I feel like you're trying to solve it too, and I'm trying to solve it as well. And I'm not doing it at work either because of the situation that I'm in with what I have. I'm not able to make these kinds of changes right now. So I'm not making any progress either on trying to solve this.
I agree. It's a big problem. And in such moments, when we have such kind of problems with, let's say with React, I don't want to blame React, but it's where we have it, right? So if it would be different technology, probably there will be different problems, but maybe this problem will not be a problem there, because there are different frameworks. I believe that they have different problems. But here with React, I believe that problem is that there is no right solution provided by framework, or as React calls it itself, library, that we could use for these cases. And from React developers' perspective, I can understand why they don't want to have any API like that. We have need to figure out how to do it properly. And I don't know yet on which table this ball is. If it's library developer problem or if it's library problem.
Mm-hmm.
Our problem is that we would like to apply some props or apply some callbacks. And realistically, if you forget about React for a second, it's not about props, it's about attributes. So one of my wild ideas was that we can stop rely on clone element. We can require to use forward ref as child. And at least it's a moment where TypeScript should help us, because forward ref components have special types. So we can ensure by at least a compiler that we will have a component that uses ref forwarding. And then we will apply these attributes directly to DOM element.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that I faced with that, and it's not something that is solved, is that then if you have callbacks like on click, in DOM you will need to bind them to a DOM element.
Mm-hmm.
But then you're getting events from DOM, not from React.
Yes. I see what you're saying, because I didn't understand it earlier, and it didn't make sense to me. Now it's making sense. You're saying that what you're doing is passing a ref down, and the ref includes all of the information on how to hook into it. It includes its own on-clicks and things like that. This is like what React Hook Form is doing. It breaks out of React and is basically like a separate library completely, and you just pass the ref in your input, and now it's able to listen to it's okay, I'm going to add the click handler, the on change, and all these things, or on input, really. It's going to put all those in there, and just because it's got access to the reference to your DOM element, that it can just mutate it that way. Yeah, that's what it is. You're mutating a DOM element.
But again, it's just an idea. It's not actual implementation. Just an idea, disclaimer.
Yeah, no, I mean, React Hook Form is popular. It's not like it's an unpopular idea that's never been tried before. That's essentially what it is to get around it. I don't like that pattern myself, but it doesn't mean it's a horrible pattern. Like you said, you're breaking out of React, and that's the biggest problem with it, is that all of a sudden you're not in React world anymore. You're bypassing React just to make this work, but then you're also framework agnostic.
Yeah, but the problem is that, we bypassed React, and now when we have these DOM events, we cannot loop back into React. So...
Yeah.
Right, because you have synthetic events in React, and you can get native event from there, but you cannot do vice versa.
I see.
And when event bubbling happens, it also will happen. I mean, DOM event bubbles up as it should, but it will not bubble up into your React tree. So this is where I face problem with that. And it's what makes complicated implementation of this on-click outside or click inside things.
That makes a lot of sense. I never considered that React, because of the synthetic events, it can handle bubbling itself and however it needs to. I had not thought of that. I probably run into issues and not realized that was why I was running into those issues, because I was separately listening to DOM events or breaking out of React events, like pointer up and down, for instance. I've had issues with passing those into the components, and so I do separate DOM listeners for those instead on refs. It bypassed whatever React was doing that was causing me some problem. Didn't even realize that was a thing. Yeah, these are really complex problems to solve. Just to make a cleaner API for this and avoid tight coupling.
It's where problem exists. There might be better solutions. I don't know them yet. Maybe there are. We will see.
Yeah, I think the most exciting thing about this for me is that the solution you guys have come up with is, in this case, this is the exact same solution I came up with. That there are similar solutions you're coming up with to the same problems, and it's independent of what I was doing. Now, it sounds like we were both inspired by Ryan Florence in some way, which is really funny. To me, any company I've been at, this is not a common solution. People do the object with arrays. That is a common solution. That's a common way a lot of people expect to solve these problems. And I think they don't actually solve them. They just create more problems and reduce flexibility on the consumers of your code and make it so difficult and complicated to actually make any kind of changes to things. Because nothing is ever hard set exactly what was in the library. It's always with some modification to it, or with some change in different instances, or in this case, I needed it this way because of this thing that you didn't consider as the library author. I'd rather put all of that responsibility on the developers and say, we made it so that you can build whatever you need and keep it at that.
Yeah, just to summarize, their flexibility is a bit dangerous, but it's also, from my last year of experience, is also key for successful development. Because as I said, we had workarounds how you can escape from these objects, how you can customize them. But again, I cannot share code, but there was around 60 lines long comment describing this workaround.
In the library, or like in somebody's app?
In application. In the application.
Oh my gosh. 60-line comment. It was so complicated. They had explained like why they were doing it this way and how they got through it and all the specifics. Yeah. So you're saying that you found out that didn't really hold as well as just having separate components that you pass into.
So it was more or less something like that.
Mhm.
But the problem is that applications are complex. Their use cases are complex. They need to handle data in complex way. And now they have complexity with the library. And overall, it creates such comments, which means that, well, this API clearly proven to be not something great. Yeah.
Yeah. So it didn't
Actually,
scale.
this example.
Yeah. It didn't scale.
It didn't scale.
That's the same issue I've come up against. And mainly I've come up against it as an application developer. The only reason I got into component library design, but I also built the applications with the component library I built. As time went on, what ended up happening was I was building applications and nobody was maintaining the component library. So I ended up building out a solution for it because I needed a solution for the component library not working in the way that I needed to. And I was like, how can I improve this? How can I improve this? How can I improve this? And I started building out these tools and different ways of doing it in a fashion like this that allowed me to have an easier way to actually build out all the components without the tight coupling. The tight coupling was the issue because you can't scale when you tight couple.
It's the same problem. I agree there. And now we can probably talk about tight coupling is not good, but where we need to make a compromise between them.
Go ahead and say like where you think that.
So we talked a lot about children first API, about collections, about this thing which is not great. We talked about triggers. There is one thing out of brackets that we didn't talk, and it's related to slots.
Oh yeah, slots.
And it's where we tried to find a balance, because I agree that children first API is great, but forcing users to lay out their components, like in this case with button, because we have different options here. We can either use button like this with slots. So we have button, icon, and then we have some children as content.
To explain what a slot is, it's a prop that takes a component. And so the button is controlling how that's rendered and not the user. And when I say the user, I mean the developer that's consuming the library.
Button controls a hole where this component will be placed.
Yeah. And you're passing that component into a prop, and that's what's going to fit into that hole.
Yeah. And again, let's jump to code as we have this opportunity. So here we are. We have export. So it's not necessarily. So it's actually kind of shorthand. So, and shorthand in terms of Notion, where we have CSS shorthands and CSS longhands. So this was short form. You can pass component directly. Long form is that it's actually props for that part of component. And if you would like to apply some other props like style with color red, button will not react on it because it defines own styles, but at least
icon does. Yeah.
Icon reacted. So basically you can do this. And another way with children first design would be to have button, have something like, I don't know, button icon wrapper or button icon. Let's simplify. It's not existing. Okay, let me just put notice there that it's not existing. Okay, and it was bad comment. And then we will need to have this icon. We will need to put it there. Then the problem is that we don't know where is our actual content, because we would like to place our content there. So then we will need to have something like button content.
You could just have it be the text, right?
I don't know. It depends on the situation, but let's imagine that we have something like that. And what is nice is that with this API, you probably can control where this icon will be in DOM. Right? Because
because I noticed you had a position left and a position right. You wouldn't have to have a prop for that. Then the user can just manage it with the position of the children.
Yeah, but then it moves us again to patterns that we discussed before, because for that we will need to read children. We will need to understand what is button content, what is button icon, and other problems that we will need to understand what is button content and what is button icon. If it's not based on position, right, because position could change, then we will need to understand based on element type, probably. But then it means that that if I replace button content with some custom components, then it will stop working.
I'm thinking different, is that just from putting them in here, they might have some inbuilt styling. So button content has some kind of styling that it can work with, and it's the same styling that would normally be in the button. And if you put a button content in there or a button icon, that icon wrapper has some kind of styling associated with it, so you can put it inside the button, and it has the right spacing and everything that you need, and allows it so that when you click the button, that icon is also getting clicked as well.
Maybe. But again, it's where we got feedback from application developers that it's more complicated and over verbose.
Oh yeah, it's definitely more complicated for sure. So this kind of API is something I would do more with like a text input, where it would make more sense where you have add-ons. Text input, I've changed how I designed it. There's one where I had the text input would take children, and then based on the context, it would associate it with a certain position and then render it there. The current API that I've come up with for a text input with add-ons, there's a context wrapping the text input, and you can put your add-ons in there. There would be a left container and a right container for it. And then in the text input itself, you would consume that context. And if the context exists, then you could say, okay, here's the icon. It literally takes the icon and puts it in the context. Like the icon component that was rendered, puts it in the context, and you just pop it in where you need it in your text input. So you'll know if it exists because it existed in the context. It's not null. You can add that as children.
So we have text input. Okay.
Yeah, and that would be wrapped in a text input provider.
Input provider.
And then you would have add-ons. I'm not saying this is good either. This is something I also came up with. The add-ons wouldn't be there. It would be children. So you'd have like a left add-on, text input like left, I don't know, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, like that. And you could put an icon in there or something like that. And then that context would take any children, the children itself, like literally the argument children, pass it into the context. So it would be a setter for the left in there. It would set the left state. And then the text input itself now has access to the context of the text provider. And it can take that icon. It's not an icon. It could be anything. Whatever content you'd passed in there, which hopefully would be an icon, it would take that and then it would pass it into a container that it's created with the div and everything for the left side. That would only display if it exists. So this is another way to do it, where you could do it with all children, and you can add it dynamically, but the text input itself has the same API. It doesn't change.
So if I will try to map it into HTML, we'll have something like div, which renders input container.
Something like this.
Based on that, then we will have input itself. And as we have left add-on, we will need to have probably a container for it, right? So because we want to ensure that it will be something like input left add-on, and then
that would take children.
My
left add-on
icon,
children. Yeah, this was what it would look like when it renders. Yeah.
Okay. Now I have complicated questions for you.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
How I will customize props on this div?
You could do a text input left add-on. That would have its own props in there. That's where you customize it. Yeah, and those get passed into the context.
Maybe I can pass something like, let's say this.
Personally, I don't allow styles on anything that's not an HTML element.
Okay, let's simplify it to real life scenario. Data test ID for some reason.
Yeah. You can just pass those props, like ... the left add-on props onto the div that's in there.
Because, the problems that we are solving with Slots API is that you can pass something to container and you can customize container itself.
Yeah, but you're customizing with an object rather than with props.
That's true. If we need to go with children first, it's what we need to target. That one rendered DOM element to one React component. And it's when I had discussions around Slots API or going with this thing, I think it's where it got more complicated because some components has really verbose markup. And so we had choice between super verbose markup or between slots.
Yeah, that's the benefit of slots, is that you have way less markup to deal with. The user has less control. You have more props you have to deal with as a component library author, but it's much simpler from a visual standpoint than you would have with children first. And I agree with that. Actually, I don't have any argument there. Children first is noisy in terms of the amount of components that you have to put in.
Yeah, and it's what we use in our discussions time to time, because I said that we have choice between one and another. And you told me before that, well, they're doing things in one way and then they expose it in a different way. And it's what we use in our discussions time to time. It's Zen of Python. And there is one thing that probably highlights, okay, it was too much, that explains why we went with one API instead of two, because there should be one and preferably one obvious way to do it. So
Personally, I like that too, that you don't have multiple ways of doing the same thing. It'd be simpler if it's just all one way to do it.
So who knows? Maybe back in time, we will reconsider this decision and we will maybe go with this. But if I would summarize, we went with slots for atomic components like button, like avatar. But when we deal with collections like menu, accordion, list, table, we prefer to use children.
I get where you're coming from. So it makes sense for atomic components. People don't have this expectation of passing a bunch of child components. And so you're taking it in the slots, and that makes the most sense there. And it usually would have the least amount of change necessary from you guys or from application developers where they're trying to hack something in. Here, where you're showing you're passing the style or the props to the icon, that's probably not something you're going to have to run into as often. I'm assuming that's a very rare case, and that's where it makes sense to use slots. Whereas with something like an accordion or a modal or a dialogue or any of those other ones, it's much more complicated. And for those situations, children first makes the most sense because it gives the most flexibility and the less that they have this jank API that they're probably going to have to use. So in this case, with the slot, you're probably not going to have to pass those extra props. But with an accordion or something else, you're going to have to. The expectation is you're most likely going to run into a situation where it makes the most sense to start making those modifications, which is why you have the children first API so that it gives that flexibility.
Yeah. And now I realize that probably there is one reasonable principle behind this. If you need to manage markup, then you need to have children first API. If you don't care much about markup and components can define it, maybe you need to use slots.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Where you tier that line between like really noisy component structures versus props APIs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the controlling of the markup. Now, I could also argue that with the icon, you are controlling the markup because you're controlling left or right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But again, it's about balance. Another thing that, well, no one pays enough attention to it, but when you are designing library, you should also ensure that it's consistent, that APIs that you are using are consistent from one component to another. So if you have slots in one atomic component, the expectation is that you will have them in another.
Yes.
And it will work in the same way. If you have collections, the expectations is, in our case, that, well, then we will allow you to customize children. And if you have triggers, then you will have this pattern with, unfortunately, implicit props. But it's where you can get used at kind of following that you learned it once and you know how to deal with it another time. But if we will switch between patterns, between components, it will be kind of against this principle. So maybe in some cases, slots could be replaced with children first design. But as we found this balance, we are trying to not violate this principle. So it may be placed against us, but it's where we landed on. In the end, it's always about requirements. And understanding them. And again, I believe that I've seen this in your video, but as a quote, but realistically, we don't know how our components will be used. And we are trying to do our best to make these components to solve use cases. That customers will have. And we also don't know them. We will see them as feedback in retrospective, and we'll try to adjust to reality how we done this with V9. Because in V9, we changed APIs compared to previous versions based on feedback and based on learnings that we had when we were talking to application developers.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you haven't gotten the feedback yet from V9.
Well, we got initial feedback. It was positive. So this is kind of wrong statement. We got a lot of positive feedback about performance, about new APIs, but we understand that with more and more adoption, there might be cases when something doesn't work or something doesn't satisfy these requirements. And, well, we will see.
Yeah.
Maybe there will be V10 that will solve some other things.
Yeah, when V10 comes out, I'd love to see what you guys changed.
So to have a conclusion about discussion that we had today, well, I think that a lot of things that we discussed today are sometimes painful experience and based on feedbacks, on learnings. And it's where we evaluated with Fluent UI V9. It's why some APIs look like they look. It doesn't mean that they are set to stone, because there might be different major version in upcoming years when we will figure out that something is different. And again, as we discussed, there are corner cases like clone element and implicit props, and it's a complex problem. We don't know how to solve it. Maybe there will be a solution, or maybe there will be something nicer that we could incorporate and make things better. It was a nice talk for me, especially because I got some ideas and, well, I also have some ideas to experiment. Maybe I will be able to make some things better, or someone who is watching this video will be able to make them better. Personally, I would like to get more feedback from non-Microsoft people on Fluent UI. So if you like ideas or dislike ideas that we raised today, probably it's good to discuss them in comments.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for spending the time to talk to me about Fluent UI version 9 and how far you guys have come and how you guys got here. I really appreciated it and hope you have a great day.